Hello everybody, Paul Hamler here. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Been working on little miniature 1911s this week, and I decided to take a little break. I'm right in the middle of finishing up the coil springs, and just wanted to do a real short video on how I make the miniature and full-size coil springs, go into a little detail on the fixture I made. But what you see in front of you here is a full-size 1911 A1 and the 2/5 scale miniature that I'm making right below it. One of the smallest springs I've had to make so far was what's referred to as a plunger tube spring right here. It's just a regular coil spring, goes inside of a casting. I think it's a 50 thousandths hole that the spring goes into. So what we're going to do today is focus on the mainspring. I've already made the recoil spring that goes up in the slide. Here's the big one, here's the little one. We've also completed the sear spring, which is a flat spring with 3 tabs on it, and we'll probably do a separate video on making this sear spring. So there's some interesting tooling involved on that. The other spring that I've already made is the magazine spring. This is a square spring, and here's the miniature inside the magazine housing. But we'll probably end up doing another video on that, because there's some complex operations involved with forming and retaining the shape of that spring. Probably the easiest springs to make are the round coil springs. There's a total of 7 springs in the 1911. 5 of them are just traditional round coil springs. The 2 exceptions are the sear spring and the magazine housing spring. But the one we're going to focus on today, the one I've been working on this week, is referred to as the mainspring trigger mainspring. Here it is in full size. And then right below it is the small one. This spring has two pieces, a tab and a retainer pin. The tab up here is a little plunger that goes in the top of the spring, and it receives the hammer linkage. And when you cock the gun and pull the trigger, it's the hammer linkage that engages with this portion of the spring. Let's see if I can get the hammer in here. Okay, here's the hammer linkage, and it engages with this plunger. So what we're going to do, you see the miniature housing. This spring with the 2 tabs goes up inside of the mainspring housing here, and here's the miniature mainspring housing. And then I've got one here that's already put together. It's got the tab installed. Here's the blank spring that we're going to make, and then just to the bottom of it are the two tabs. One of them's called a retaining mainspring pin retainer. That's what keeps the housing in the gun. The other one they just call it a cap mainspring. That's the one that engages with the hammer linkage. So we'll be turning this spring on the fixture that I made, and then we'll insert the 2 pins in it, and that whole assembly will slide up inside of the mainspring housing, and it's held in place with just a small spring, a small pin that goes through the top of the casting. So with that said, I'll just point out that this plunger tube spring that I've already made, the one that goes inside of a 50 thousandths diameter, I guess that's probably the smallest spring on the gun. There's a picture of it inside of the plunger tube. And just to give you an idea, with this little fixture that I've got over here that we're going to be making the mainspring housing spring on, is people, when they look at the plunger tube spring, they think it's pretty small. But let me just show you what you can do here. Here's a spring that was made out of 3,000 wire. The spring was wrapped around a 10,000th mandrel. And at the end of the arrow there is the actual spring. This spring, if a guy wanted to make this gun half scale from the 2/5, which is 40%, the scale would be 20%. This particular spring was made to fit the mainspring housing in a 1911 that's 20% full size, or half size the gun that I'm working on now. Excuse me. Okay, with that, let me stop the camera here and we'll set up on the spring maker, and we'll show you how we make these round springs. Okay, here's an overall view of the spring winder that I fabricated. Fairly simple to make. It was made out of 80/20 extrusion pieces and a off-the-shelf 5C spin fixture that accepts 5C collets. Depending on the size of the spring that I'm making, in some cases I can just go directly with the mandrel into the collet. When I get into the really small springs, I usually put a small chuck in there to hold the mandrel, and the tailstock has got a bushing in it that matches the hole in the bushing matches the mandrel size. I think the spring for this mainspring, the size mandrel that I'm using is a 54 thousandths OD mandrel. The mandrel has installed on it a little bushing. They're called Dura collars, 1/8 of an inch. I think they go down to a 1/16. Of course, it's a relatively easy collar to make. But I put the collar on the mandrel and I drill a hole in through the mandrel sideways to hold the wire. Usually I'm using music wire. In this case here, it's scaled down where I needed 18 thousandths wire for the mandrel. Sizing the mandrel, it's not an exact science. It's a little bit of trial and error where you get in the ballpark. Usually I go about 10 thousandths below. I'm sorry, yes, 10 thousandths below the mandrel size that I want to retain on the inside diameter of the spring. As I said, this is a 54 thousandths mandrel that's in there now, and it's just a matter of trial and error. Sometimes if it works out, it's never really worked out that well for me. You could use a piece of all thread or threaded rod. Got a piece leaning upside the tailstock chuck there, and you could use the grooves in the all thread to form your distance of your windings, the separation of your winding. Now, you'll typically end up making a compression spring, an expansion spring with this fixture, but once you get the feel of it, you could actually separate your windings with the control of it and make you a compression spring. Of course, if you don't get it exactly right, if you've got a compression spring or an expansion spring, you can stretch it out and convert it into a compression spring. The post in the back is where the wire feeds in. You can see it's threaded. It's got a piece of wire coming through it now. That fixture can be slid back and forth for along the back for longer springs. It's got two pieces of boxwood and an adjustment so you can change the tension on the wire and tighten it up so that you've got resistance as you're winding the spring. Once you get it set, you kind of get the feel for how much tension that you want. So what we'll do here is we'll take the, if I get good close up here, we'll take the mandrel out and load it up in preparation for turning a spring. Like I said, the bushing that's inside of the tailstock has been pre-drilled. The bush has been pre-drilled to receive the mandrel, and it's just for support while you're turning it. So what we'll do is we'll loosen the tension, stick the wire through the hole, once we get it coming through the hole, we'll bend it 90 degrees, and then we'll also bend the wire 90 degrees where it's going to begin forming the spring. Then we'll put it in the headstock chuck and tighten the mandrel. We'll pull the slack. We'll pull the slack out of the wire and move it down a little bit closer. Depending on the length of the spring, you might have to move this tension mechanism a couple of times as you're traveling down the length of the spring. So we've got the wire in there, it's threaded. The next thing to do is pull the tailstock up, feed the mandrel through there, and you set the length just a little bit longer than you want your spring to be, the distance from here to here. And that's by adjusting the position of the tailstock and then locking it in. So if I can get a close up here, it's going to be difficult to do and keep. Let me move the camera here. Okay, we're loaded up, and what I'm going to do is put my thumb on the wire that's coming through the tension mechanism, and kind of as I'm turning the spring, as I'm turning the spin fixture, the wire starts wrapping around the mandrel, and to a certain extent, by controlling the thumb pressure with my thumb and pushing towards the tailstock, I can control the spacing of the coil of the spring. I know I need 21 turns. I've made so many of these that I know that if I get to the end of the tailstock there, that's the bushing that's supporting the mandrel, I'm going to be pretty close. So now that the spring is coming off, the wire is coming off at 90 degrees, I'm going to loosen the tension support and shift it to the left to build in the pitch angle that I want the spring to wind at. Usually on a spring this length, I think the overall length's a little over 3/4. Just one position is sufficient. When it gets to the point where the wire is feeding in 90 degrees to the mandrel, you can put thumb pressure and push it towards the tailstock, and the wire will flex enough to maintain and continue doing the pitch that you're trying to achieve. Okay, there's a spring. It's wound the distance we want it. Now the next operation is go in here with wire cutters and clip the spring, move the tailstock off the mandrel, and remove the mandrel from the headstock. Okay, here's the spring that we just formed, still on the mandrel. What I'll do at this point is loosen the set screw on the mandrel, or the collar, slip it off the mandrel. And now that it's been removed, I take it over to the bench with the Dremel cutoff tool. I cut the spring off near the end of the mandrel where it was started, and there's your finished spring. Now, before you remove it from the mandrel, if you have any unequal coils or spacing that you want to adjust, you can do it at this point by compressing or pulling to even out your spacing. On a spring of this nature where it's concealed and hitting, all I'm concerned about is getting it with the right tension, the right diameter, and to fit inside of the housing. Aesthetics is not a big concern for this particular spring. So that pretty well wraps it up. If you have any questions, shoot me a comment. If you like the video, give me a like. Try to subscribe to the channel if you haven't, and we'll try to keep these videos coming out as frequently as we can. With that said, have a nice day. Bye.